Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's delightful to see such a full room on this first day of Global Landscape Forum. And it's my pleasure to introduce the discussion forum on agro-ecological landscapes for food security, resilient ecosystems and livelihoods. And this is the session where we join food and forest together and discuss the issues related to that. My name's Duncan McQueen, and I'm here on behalf of the International Institute for Environment and Development, but also the Forest and Farm Facility, which is hosted by Rome and is a partnership involving FAO and IAED and IUCN and AgriCorps. And this session is particularly set up and organized by the World Bank and by the FAO. It's my great pleasure to invite to the stage two honorable speakers who will give some opening remarks.
So this forum, the World Bank and the FAO, really hope it will be an important contribution to the 2018 Global Landscapes Forums. So this event, in fact, built on the series of discussion forums that we organized in the last years at the GLF. So that was designed to help us think outside the box. So on how to combine landscape restorations with food securities and livelihood. So integrated landscape management can contribute to so many of the SDGs, and there is a tremendous potential to restore hundreds of millions of hectares, creating a new natural resource asset base for the rural poor. But in order to maximize these contributions, we have to be very explicit in including food securities and people's livelihood, particularly of indigenous peoples, local communities, smallholders, women, and youth, and of course senior as well, and who depend on and shoulders much of the responsibilities for these territories and the large landscapes. The way countries set policies, integrate across the sectors, align tenures, and build producers' organizations, and design and implement the technical solutions will determine how well they can integrate the approaches. We as supporting organizations must work to integrate our own effort and collaborate more effectively together. So we all have the huge expectation from the territories and landscapes, so that underpins the sustainability of our future together on this planet. But we cannot assume that these expectations will be met without substantial amount of collective effort on the part of all of us here, and those actually living and working in the forest, the field, the pastures, the rivers, and the coastal areas that provide what we need for healthy and prosperous lives for all. So the Global Landscape Forum, GLF provides a great opportunity to move the landscape agenda forward in a way that we believe can make a difference and allow us to break out the business as usual way of the working. To FAO and many of our partners, this means breaking down the institutional and the sectoral silos and finding new ways to join forces and work toward achieving multiple objectives that address human needs and environmental concerns simultaneously. This integrated approach is also the core of SDGs, and also sustainably managed landscapes are critical to achieving these. So at FAO, the food securities and the livelihood are part of our DNA. And we believe that by keeping these needs central to all of our effort, we can ensure that our work at the landscape scale provides the greatest range of the benefit. So our hope is that today's event will provide us with a better understanding of what is actually working on the landscapes in different parts of the world, and perhaps where we still have the room for improvement. So I look forward to hearing from our excellent speakers and panels, and also from those of you attending. Please enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hiroto, and a powerful call to all of us to collaborate and to break down these silos between agriculture, forestry, and the many other sectors. Now it's my privilege to invite Karen Kemper, who's Senior Director for Environment and Natural Resources of Global Practice at the World Bank. And she too has extensive experience in the bank on a wide range of topics, from climate finance to the natural resources sector, and so on, and also lectures and publishes on these subjects. So it's a great pleasure to invite you to the stage to give your opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone, dear Hiroto and dear colleagues and dear participants who are connected on the web. I'd like to thank you for joining this discussion forum, which we are organizing jointly with the FAO, so we can discuss the approaches for integrating forests and food systems, which is a very important topic. So we know that roughly 40% of the planet's land mass, excluding the deserts and the permanent ice and lakes, is used to grow food. And that makes the global food system a key force in shaping our landscapes, impacting the forest cover, biodiversity, ecosystems, and ecosystem services. And as such, agriculture has been a key driver of land use change and deforestation, and it's responsible for up to 80% of forest conversion. In addition, our current land use practices make that we lose land to degradation each year. And just to remind you, because I know many of you know the statistics, 24 billion tons of fertile soil are eroded and 12 million hectares of land succumb to desertification and drought. And this compromises efforts to end global hunger, and it contributes, of course, to carbon emissions. And that challenge then is compounded by growing demand for food, which is projected to increase by 50% by 2050. And that's both due to the growing world population, but also the consumption patterns, because as people get out of poverty and they get into lower middle class and into middle class, they look for more complex foods, and that often is meat. And meat needs much more production input than if one eats the grains, for instance, and the vegetables themselves. So income levels that we are all striving for to get people out of poverty at the same time have this effect of leading to more land use and land degradation if we don't do it right. Now, meeting all of this demand in a business-as-usual approach would threaten to further degrade lands and drive deforestation, and that would have significant consequences for livelihoods. And as we were saying in the opening session, it's especially the poor that do depend on their natural resources and their natural resource capital. So obviously, we need to transform how we grow our food and how we use our lands and how we think about those areas that are already degraded and those that are not degraded and how we can conserve them. Now, that is sort of the dire part of the picture. But then, because we want to discuss with everyone and look forward, let me talk a bit about the good news and the positive picture. So one is that we can increase crop productivity and green supply chains to minimize deforestation and habitat conversion. And we can restore soils and degraded areas to healthy ecosystems and to productive landscapes. We can also work across sectors to value the important services that forests and trees provide to sustain agriculture. That includes water regulation, erosion prevention, improved soil health, habitat for pollinators, and biological control of weeds, among other ecosystem services, and better to integrate forests, trees, and agriculture through upstream land use planning. And change is underway in a lot of places. I thought it was very interesting to hear the gentleman from Burkina Faso talk about what he did many, many years ago on his farm. And actually that is, in a way, very much the approach that in very dry areas and very poor areas that countries are employing. And on the World Bank side, we are helping countries do that. So for instance, in Burundi, we have estimated the cost of land degradation and deforestation at 13% of GDP. That is really huge when you're a poor country, because you really need to use your GDP to get a healthier population and to grow sustainably and for people to be better off. You don't want to degrade your land and your forests and lose it on the other end. It also has childhood stunting levels that are among the highest in the world. So there the World Bank is working with the government to implement a 30 million landscape restoration and resilience project. And it looks on the one hand and is investing in decreasing this costly soil erosion and in restoring agricultural productivity, for instance, by terracing the landscape, introducing trees on farms, and diversifying crops. But it also specifically looks at nutrition, and it doesn't just let it happen all by itself. And so it invests in high nutrition crops such as improved sweet potatoes and bananas to help combat stunting and increase food security. And that, I think, is one of the examples how one looks across sectors and doesn't look only at one part of the equation. There's many more countries that have taken action and that are planning to take action. 140 countries have landscape restoration in their NDCs. And I think we are all here to hear from the panelists who are going to speak now to see how can country go about that, how can we accelerate it, and how can we look at the equation of those countries that have already started doing something, but also countries who don't want to go down the path of degradation and of losing more forests or losing the quality of their soils. So in closing, I'd like to underscore that the World Bank is committed to working with countries and development partners, especially FAO, to enable this urgent transition to sustainable food production systems. I very much look forward to the discussions in this session, and it's great that you are all here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Yes, that's the challenge we're facing. How do we go about it? How do we meet these needs for food, but without degradation? Well, we've got a panel to begin to answer those questions, and we've set up this panel to look at three levels: the jurisdictional level, the regional level, the project level, and then the community level. So I'm going to call up the three panelists right from the beginning. And first is colleague Eric Fernandez, who's the World Bank's global lead on technology, innovation, and climate-smart agriculture. And he works on landscape scale issues across the World Bank's agricultural, environment, and climate change programs. I have to confess that we first met back in the day when we were collecting agroforestry seed in Central America. So it's lovely to meet up with you again. Please do come and take a seat on the panel. And then our second speaker is Drita Dade, who's a senior natural resources management specialist at the World Bank. And she has just finished as team leader for the Environmental Land Management and Rural Livelihoods Initiative in Tajikistan that will be presented today. So she works in the World Bank office in Albania and is team leader of the Environmental Services Project and co-team leader of the Water Resources and Irrigation Project. So you'll hear a different perspective from her. Please come up. And our final panelist, Larry Fuentes. Larry Paul Fuentes is a project and program developer, a specialist relating to agriculture and livelihoods, with almost 20 years of experience in planning and monitoring and evaluation of 50 projects and programs in Central America, particularly strong on community empowerment and livelihoods. So please do come up and give the community's perspective too. When I was, I've just joined this meeting from Phoenix in Arizona, where a delegation of Guyanese were visiting Arizona State University. And one of them said, if you want to walk fast, you walk alone. But if you want to walk far, you walk together. And so we're a panel who's going to try and walk far by combining food and forests. Let me hand over to you, Eric, as our first speaker for today.
Should I go over there?
Probably is good to
Probably
go across.
better.
Yeah, I think.
Thank you very much. Again, it's an enormous privilege to be here. I've met many colleagues that I haven't seen for decades, so that's always a delightful core benefit. It's surprising how we've aged, but the emphasis is resilience. We're still here, right?
That's right.
We're still here. Anyway, so delighted to be here. I was asked to focus on jurisdictional approaches. How do we mitigate deforestation via jurisdictional approaches? We had very nice introductory statements from our keynote speakers here. The essential message there: how do we decouple food production that's required for expanding populations very quickly? How do we decouple the demand for increased food at local scales, at regional scales, at global scales, and yet preserve our environment, preserve the forests that are so key for our ecosystems, for our ecosystem services? And I think that is a challenge that we have been wrestling with for a very long time. What I'd like to start with, I have basically 5 slides. I'd like to sort of focus very quickly in the first slide on sort of what exactly jurisdictional approaches imply, and why these have come about. Karen mentioned very nicely the starting role or the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the efforts under RED, reduced emissions from deforestation, degradation, and how we try to do this not just in the forest, but we look at this in the landscape as a whole. Because forests, woodlands, vegetation associated with forests are at landscape scales. You often find them from the highest point in the landscape to the water margins, whether it's lake shores, whether it's riverine forests, whether it's mangroves. And somebody reminded me that even when you get into the sea, you've got the seagrass meadows, which in recent years have come to the fore as to how important these seagrass meadows that we often don't see they are in this landscape approach. Very often, that sector between land and water tends to be in no one's mandate. It's surprising how often our ministries are organized, and that's part maybe of the opportunity, both the challenge and opportunity as we look forward. Anyway, over time, I think, what we found is that, as we will see, the convergence from the public sector and the private sector is what has basically brought together this idea of a jurisdictional approach. And I think that's a really interesting convergence. It's a convergence both in terms of where we want to be, what are the outcomes, sustainable food supplies with reduced environmental damage, environmental degradation, forest degradation, and how do we then encourage and empower and work with local land users. So that's, I think, a critical game changer in the jurisdictional approach. The jurisdictional approach also, that last point in this slide, focuses at the political level where many of the land use decisions are often made and enforced. So I think, as was highlighted in the beginning, this is much more a macro vision of how it comes together. But as we will see in the next slide, it involves various types of initiatives. And this is a slide that nicely summarizes, I think, some of the three big categories of jurisdictional approaches that have been tried and are still undergoing trials in various parts of the world. So the models that deliver these blanket demand signals, to the market, such as corporate pledges to source commodities from geographies that demonstrate improved sustainability. That's a sort of a first broad category of jurisdictional approaches. The second one is very specific, where you actually have some form of certification involved. In this particular case, palm oil is a good example, where you've got companies and others working very, very closely with certification to try and improve the use of the land. And then that third one, which is very, very locally place-based initiatives that bring together both the supply and demand side as stakeholders to agree on sustainability goals and implementation strategies. And these three really now have present us, I think, with some very interesting lessons learned. So what have been the lessons learned across these range of jurisdictional approaches? Remember, the outcome is let's reduce deforestation, because that's such an important anchor in our landscapes, the forests. Both productive-wise, forests, biodiversity repositories, holding and sequestering carbon. They're so important in the global water cycle. If you see the energy pumps that come out of the Amazon, the Congo, and the Indonesian Sumatran rainforest, it's just amazing the power of these forests to drive global circulation patterns as they pump all that water out through evapotranspiration. So there are these huge energy pumps that really keep us going. And as they get destabilized, we are increasingly beginning to see patterns that don't look very good for global processes, for regional processes, in terms of what happens with rainfall, in terms of what, I don't know if you've probably heard of these flying rivers that transport enormous amounts of water in the sky. And I think the Brazilians have quantified the amount of water. So the Amazon, which is this massive river that all of you know about, I think it has been quantified at dropping something like 18 trillion cubic liters of water into the Atlantic Ocean every day. That's a lot of water. But the flying river that comes out, or that comes from the Atlantic into the Amazon picks it up, pumps it, and then drives it south, brings about 20 trillion cubic liters of water to central Brazil, to southern Brazil, all the way to Mar del Plata. And so it's extremely important as an ecosystem service, but think of the economic value of that, So you've got over 95% of Brazilian agriculture is rain-fed. Over 60% of Brazilian energy is hydropower. What would it take to substitute that in economic terms if this river were to be impacted? So, and deforestation dynamics could do that. I'm not saying it will. So, what are the lessons learned so far from these approaches? The political leadership is really key, you need that commitment at the highest levels of government, but while it's key, it's also a potential risk, because government's changed. Now, where has this happened recently that puts this at risk? I won't pursue that question anymore, but just keep that in mind. Participatory design, this push for quick results and desire to avoid opposition sometimes interfere with early inclusive engagement. People are so anxious to get going that you tend to sort of run over, if you like, stakeholders, local stakeholders, community stakeholders, And that you really need to be careful of that. You need to have engagement and participation. Sustainable financing, this is quite important, and several types of financing are needed at various stages to sustain these, and to keep everybody going, I think. So keep that in mind, because jurisdictional approaches on their own are unlikely to be sufficient. So you need jurisdictional approaches, many of the lessons are showing, as a complement to existing approaches that are there. So they don't replace existing efforts to reduce deforestation, but complement potentially quite nicely. And maintaining sustainable financing is quite important. The private sector really plays quite a critical role, and often because of the market forces involved, they can actually leverage, or public finance can leverage private finance. So for that to happen, you need the right legal frameworks, fiscal frameworks, the confidence needed for markets and investors to put their money in these procedures. So I think that's something that's quite important. And it's important to distinguish these needs and roles of the different private sector actors. Okay? Storytelling. So the ability to communicate what exactly you're trying to do via jurisdictional approaches is quite important. Okay? Because it's complex. It's not that easy. It's not that easy to discuss as a simple approach to ending deforestation because of the need to engage with different parts of the stakeholder community. And so to be able to tell an effective story is quite important, we've discovered, based on the models that have been in place for the last several years. And then finally, really manage expectations. So the jurisdictional approaches take time. Because of the fact that you need to engage with different communities, different stakeholders, you're not going to achieve this in 1 or 2 or 3 years. So having a realistic time frame is really key, and then sort of ensuring that you have the outcomes over time. So I'm going to put some questions here that will help us think through this carefully. And they appear in blue. So I mean, what interventions need to be paired with intensification to ensure that deforestation actually declines? Because there are examples where intensification works, and then all that happens is that you increase deforestation if you don't have the right legal and other frameworks there. And many years ago, I was involved in that Alternatives to Slash and Burn program funded by the GEF, and the CG institutes and national agencies were involved, and that's exactly what was becoming obvious very quickly. What are the mechanics of successful policy reform, and what level of government is it needed? There are examples of national efforts. Many of them have to be national, but there are significant efforts at local state governments. In Brazil, the state of Acre, the state of Mato Grosso have very nice examples. And then you have other countries as well where this is happening. In Colombia, the Orinoquia is doing some very, very nice efforts to sort of have land use planning, etc. This early stakeholder engagement is really key, and what are the effective strategies, I think, that, motivate the different stakeholders to be engaged, okay? How can markets be moved to preference products from sustainable sources as to offer a premium for such products? I remember in the early, I'm a forester by training, but in the early forest certification programs, many of the complaints from the people who worked with forest certification were that there were no premiums. So you went through all the effort and the expense of getting certification, and then nobody gave you a premium on that for good practice. Okay. So it's still an issue. How can domestic markets be moved to exert pressure where external market levers are limited or where demand for sustainable products is weak? That's really quite interesting, and we have fewer examples of how domestic markets are working. In many cases, you find that because domestic markets are weak in their demands, you don't have the incentive for sustainable management and jurisdictional approaches. How should markets treat lack of progress? Don't be discouraged. Remember, we said keep the long view and keep working at the challenges, and don't just sort of start to blacklist and penalize. And I think that's another important lesson from the efforts to date. And finally, how should the value of a jurisdictional approach be judged, given that some may fail and some might not set a very high bar to begin with? The message there, I think, is don't be discouraged. There are enough positive signals, as we're seeing from some of the previous slides, to help us to sort of better work on this. Okay, So a lot of this comes from sort of, there's lots of studies, but this first one that WWF commissioned, I think 2 years ago, is a very useful one, tackling deforestation through a jurisdictional approaches, lessons from the field, where I've drawn a lot of this. And more recently in the bank, we've just finished a nice study leveraging agricultural value chains to enhance tropical tree cover and slow deforestation. LEAVES. That was a cool acronym, I thought. But look for it. We've tackled the major commodities: beef, soybean, oil palm. We've also taken a look at commodities that bring trees back into the landscape: shaded coffee, shaded cocoa, silvopastoral systems from Latin America, very diverse from Mexico all the way to Chile. And those studies are now finally have gone through final editing, and they will be available very soon on the Pro4 website. So Karin mentioned earlier about this Pro4 initiative that the World Bank has. Very, very valuable in helping us to engage with stakeholders, to help all our various colleagues to work through that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric, for setting the scene at the jurisdictional level. And so many challenges. So thank you for throwing out all of those very interesting challenges, which I hope will form the basis of some of your questioning once the panelists are finished. But let me turn now to the project level in Tajikistan. Drita, please do take the floor.
I would like to talk today about the results of the project in Tajikistan, which was just finished in May this year. And we are happy to be able to share the good results, but also to walk you through what the Tajik government, together with local governments, local communities, did to really deal with land degradation, climate risks as well during the implementation of this project. Just to set the scene, Tajikistan is a very mountainous area, so 90% of its surface area is mountainous, and only 6% is arable land, and less than 3% is forest. So it's a lot of pasture land and also agriculture, but mostly subsistence agriculture. And 2/3 of the population is rural, which means that they are heavily dependent on agriculture as an employment source, but also 31.3% of the population, according to the 2015 data, live below poverty line, and they are all in poverty areas. So the project focused on several, three main agro-ecological zones, and it was implemented over a 5-year period. It was funded by GEF, PPCR, part of the Strategic Climate Fund as well, and also IDA credit of the World Bank. And the objective was that how can we improve natural resource management in these three agroecological zones that fall under these 6 climate vulnerable districts that the project was focused on, as they refer to lowlands, middle hills, and highlands as well. And the idea is that how, through improved natural resource management, how you create productive assets for rural people, and productive assets not only in terms of physical investment in water management, pasture management, and agricultural land management, but also social, how to engage people, how to change the mindset on how to better protect the resources, and how to get also production from effective management practices. And financial, because also the project provided grants to local communities that were organized in common interest groups or water user associations or pasture user unions throughout the country. And the overall results of the project, and we have just finalized our evaluation of the project, and we hope within next week also the report will be released to the public. And so we see that the number of direct beneficiaries that benefited from these investments, it's about 323,000, and 40% of them were women. There are 53% of people that have an increased 20% of income and also livelihood assessed. This is based on well-being index and well-being survey, as well as impact assessment done for the various type of investments that were funded under the project. And we also have other figures in terms of the households that have improved the way they are managed their resources, and then also the number of hectares that have been improved because of these effective management practices that have been used. Water management is a big thing in Tajikistan because there was need to invest. So both on water management, but also on land management and how interlinked they are. And because of the investments done through the project, the results were reduced salinity, water logging, and also reduced mud flows to the fields. Tajikistan is very heavily impacted by climate change risks, and also through the observed patterns, but also through the forecasting scenarios. So the climate impact will be worsened for the country, and not only that, but also some scenarios show that by 2050 there will be an increase in temperature by 2%, so 2 degrees Celsius, sorry, and so whatever investments were decided by the communities and with the help of technical experts, everything was screened through the climate lens. So in the end, due to the investments, we have about 47 to 67% in water availability. And also one of the innovations that was also scaled up in the country was the adoption of drip irrigation for horticulture, which increased the production for unit area, but also conserved water. And also, as regards land management, there were lots of support provided to farmers regarding the investments in intercrop horticulture, greenhouses, beekeeping. And besides them being like income generation activities, they also better conserved the land and conserved water. So in a way, the communities also adapted to climate risk because extreme weather events are very frequent in Tajikistan in terms of flash floods or drought. Pasture management also was another focus area. And the idea was how to improve the access of people, of communities, to the underutilized pastures in the high up area. But for that, you needed to improve the roads and also create animal shelters. There was a lot of experiences in several districts of Tajikistan on how to better manage the pasture and the rotational management of seasonal grazing areas, and also how to improve livestock breeding to reduce the pressure on pasture. The project also managed to have a systemic assessment from the start of all the benefits that the project investments would have in terms of carbon sequestration. And not only that, but there were a lot of soil samples analyzed to determine the soil nutrition content and chemical composition. And this is the figure on the carbon balance for a 20-year period is about 1 million tons of CO2 sequestered. One of the innovations of the project was the knowledge and experience sharing. The project managed to establish the sustainable land management platform that is even maintained now after the project has been closed, where community-based organizations led by an NGO in Dushanbe, they managed to produce videos of several projects in several project sites. And not only that, but they also had exchange visits from one region to the other and tried to capture all this in lots of different types of training and communication materials that were produced. And we are happy to see that now the Tajik government would like to scale this up, and happy to see that this was a good model that they would like to invest in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Drita. And nice to see the sort of role of women and the importance of community-based organization and communication and storytelling in what you said as well. Finally, we're going now to go to the community level. Larry from Guatemala, please do take the floor.
Good afternoon. Thanks to FAO and World Bank for inviting us to present our experience of the project called Forest Values. We are an alliance of 3 institutions. Oro Verde, it's a German NGO. Heifer International is a US NGO. And Defensores de la Naturaleza, it's a national and Guatemalan NGO. And we are working together since 3 years in this project. And we have this map of Guatemala, which represents the area we are working on. These are 2 protected areas. One is Sierra de la Candón, that is near the border of Mexico, and the second one is Sierra de las Minas, that is another protected area that has a lot of biodiversity. So in these protected areas, we are working close with the community. And we have 49 communities that are doing participatory process of planning of their farms, and they decide to work on 3 value chains in order to do the restoration of the forest. So this project has a lot of involvement of the community, and there's 4 objectives of this project. The first one is to have the forest conservation and restoration at the protected areas. We have the second objective is the value chains that have developed for commercial purposes. We have 3 value chains. We are moving on honey, Mayan nut, and cocoa. And the third one is the relation with food security and alternatives for local rural families for consumption. So, and the last but not least are the business model and innovative commercial strategies to involve private sector on the forest restoration. So with these 4 objectives, when we start the project, we have the problem of we don't have too much monitoring of the core zones, and we have some families that go inside the forest to cut the trees. So we start to do this monitoring and a total of 180,000 hectares. Also, we start working with the government of Guatemala in order to have the incentives, the mixed plantations and the forest incentives. We are involving more than 400 families that are doing this reforestation with native species. And also, we are taking care of the core areas in order to avoid the deforestation. we are very committed to work with these value chains because at the beginning of the project, we do a participatory process in which the families of the communities decide what are the main sources that can generate more income to them. And these are value chains that are environmentally and land restoration friendly. So what we start to work on is to analyze the value chain. In every segment, we have the bottlenecks of these value chains. And we start to work in the case of the cocoa production on the capacity building. Because, you know, it's some of our countries in Central America, the cocoa is, the farmers wash the cocoa, and the quality of the cocoa is in the fermentation process. So we start to work on the fermentation and drying process, and we support these agro-biodiverse systems that has more than 10 to 15 species of shade for the cocoa. The second value chain is the Mayan nut. I don't know if most of you know the Mayan nut, but its name is Brosimum. And it's very common tree on the Petén and the south of Mexico area. And it's a lot of trees there, and you can not harvest the seed, but you only need to pick from the soil. But in this case, they don't have the facilities to process and to dry this nut. So that what we did is that we built infrastructure in the communities in order to dry the Mayan nut. So that was a very success. We have the second harvest this year, and they are increasing the income of the farmers. And last, we have the sustainable beekeeping. At this year, we are working with 300 families. They have more than 2,300 beehives, and they are selling in the local markets. And this is the second harvest that they are already selling the honey in industries and other restaurants in Guatemala City. So on the other hand, we don't forget the food security. We are working also with food security and alternatives for rural families in order to have their own food. So in the cocoa plantations or the cocoa farms, we also have plantains, yuca, basic grains, and you know the milpa system, that is the corn and maize and other herbs that people used to eat in the community. So, and also we are increasing the local consumption of Mayan nut because now they are near the communities because they are picking up from the forest, and the consumption of honey also is increasing in these communities. So you can see here some cookies that they are doing with the Mayan nut, so they are increasing their consumption of these two products. And also, to have this value chain analysis and this value chain approach, we have to contact the markets. We support communities in order to do business tables, to do meetings with the buyers in order to have a better and fair price for the products. But at the same time, we provide some working capital as a revolving fund that leads to a guarantee fund to a cooperative of Guatemala for processing the cocoa beans and Mayan nut. Because you know, every time a farmer comes with a bag of cocoa seeds or Mayan nut seeds, they need the cash at the time. They are not going to wait too much. And we also are working on the development of dissemination of concrete criteria for involvement for the private sector. Yesterday, we were having a very good conversation with our colleagues of Oro Verde and other personalities that they invite at the office in order to see what are the preparation phases that the project or a process needs to have investment of the private sector. And it was a very good takeaways in order to have better preparement and pre-investment stages in order to have this investment of the private sector. And I will share with you 3 of the main key findings that we are having in the project with the participation of the community. And something that is very key for us is the community-based organization and the capacity building, but also the participatory process. At this moment, we have 27 communities that are working as a committee of second level, and they are moving to having a social enterprise that will be held next year in order to negotiate their own products. On the other hand, in this value chain approach, we are sure that we need to have investments. We need to have investments in infrastructure and also in working capital, because if the communities are not going to have this infrastructure, it's difficult to them for have facilities for drying, for processing, or for having a good quality of the products that leads to a new market. And other thing that we have as a key finding is that the environment for the restoration in Guatemala especially is very, it's enabling, because the forest incentives of the Guatemalan government are moving from incentives that are more directed for monocropping or monoforestry or only one kind of tree, and only for huge owners of land, but now they are changing or shifting the law in order to have more smallholder farmers that are involving in these agroforestry or forestry programs, but also not only the ones that own the land, but also the communities that has possession on the land, and with a signal of the municipality, you can apply for these incentives now. So there are some shifts in the policies that are making this environment more enable to work for the smallholder farmers. So these are the key findings that we have in this project, that is a community-based approach project, and we are very happy to be here and to share the table with our colleagues, and let's see if there are some questions about the project. Thank you.
Take your, let me give you your book just in case you need it. Thank you very much, Larry. So there you have it. You've seen a variety of scales and a degree of integration between food and forests at each of those scales, from jurisdictional approaches, often with very large private sector, all the way through national level projects integrating water and forests and agriculture, down to community level organization and community business. Often actually we think of this scale of private sector as large-scale private sector to small-scale private sector. And I think in the Forest Farm facility we challenge that, and actually we say that the largest private sector is the collective mass of smallholders, communities, and indigenous peoples, which approaches, if we're to be believed, about $1.5 trillion in gross annual production. So small together can be big. So very interesting set of presentations. Thank you all for shedding such light and showing us how success is being achieved. I'm going to open the floor now. I promised I would. We've got some roving mics. What we'll do is we'll take 1 or 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll invite our panelists to respond. So who's going to be brave enough to be first? Yes, we have a gentleman there and a lady here. This is where I wish I'd brought my glasses, and I might even be able to name some of you. Why don't you?
Hello. I just want to make a question in reference to, you're talking about food security and obviously producing more food in a sustainable way, but I want to ask the panel, what do they think about basically the world is producing food on converting oil calories or petroleum calories to food calories. So basically, if producing food takes away or causes deforestation, 10% causes 10% of global warming, let's say, then the real problem would be producing food without petroleum addiction. Or what do you think about this?
Very good, thank you very much. So a question on how can we get ourselves off the addiction of oil in food production. Who is next? Yes, down here at the front.
Yes, so my name is Ramni Jamnadas. I'm from World Agroforestry Center, ICRAF. I got very excited when I saw the title of this presentation, Agroecology, and then Karen mentioned integrating forests and food systems. That got me even more excited. This morning we had a session on tree seeds and seedling systems, and I raised a question. Does anyone know how many food trees, that is trees that produce fruits, nuts, oils, vegetables, are on the continent of Africa? Probably not, because when you go to our markets, you'll find apples, oranges, mangoes. Occasionally, nowadays you started finding baobab. That's the only indigenous species. There are 800 food tree species on my continent, and there are 3 or 4 in our markets. So when the gentleman talked about value chains, you talked about one species. You know, the world's in trouble. There's obesity, especially when we were starting to talk about well-being and health and linking up forestry with food systems. We need to mention these things, and we need to bring this, and there needs to be investment in this. Otherwise, 40% of those tropical trees are threatened, and we're losing them real fast. So let's get that conversation, agroecology, also to include not single value chains of tree here and a tree there, but all those trees that need to be part of our food systems.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for making that important point. I'd encourage you to phrase these things as a question to the panel so they can also answer. I guess your question is, why isn't more being done to diversify the sorts of trees we're using? Some comment, okay, great. And then we had one more here, and then I'll put the questions to the panel.
Thank you. My name is Peter. I am the tree planting officer from Ecosia, the search engine that plants trees. I had a question to learn. What is the kind of the lesson learned when it comes to how replicable this model is? It's always amazing when you see all these non-timber forest products coming out, and then you think like, why have no one ever thought about this before? Or maybe they have. So what do you think? How can this be scaled up, and what would be needed for that?
Great. Thank you very much. Well, let's take a break there and ask some of these questions to our panelists. So we have the questions of getting away from oil addiction, questions of how do we diversify the sorts of things that are being planted beyond the 1 or 2 in the market, and the questions of how replicable are these models that you've described. Eric, do you want to take a first stab?
Yeah, I'll try. Thank you for those questions. They're very, very, very exciting. I'll take a crack, especially at the first one about the addiction to fossil fuels in our food production systems. The example that comes to mind is the global reliance on nitrogen fertilizer. As you know, nitrogen is a critical nutrient. It's often not available easily. Nature fixes about 300 million tons of nitrogen a year through lightning and other atmospheric processes. And I think the world produces synthetic nitrogen in the order of 150, 200 million tons. So nature is actually producing much more nitrogen. The issue, I guess, in the food production system is that nitrogen that nature produces is not always available where the food production system is. And so synchrony of the availability of nitrogen with food crop requirements is not good. Hence the idea that you could use synthetic nitrogen fixation to do that. Now, the synthetic process is the Haber-Bosch, right? Fritz Haber was the scientist who discovered this in the early 1900s, and Bosch was the guy who actually commercialized it, made it possible to produce large amounts of synthetic nitrogen. That process is 1900s. I mean, nothing else has showed up since then. I mean, who drives a 1900 model car nowadays? I mean, even our bicycles don't seem to be that old, right? Nevertheless, this is the process that uses between 1% and 2% of the global energy budget. So it's huge. And it produces 1% to 2% of the pollution that we often face. So if you follow the planetary boundary discussion, the excess of nitrogen in our ecosystems, both terrestrial and aquatic, is just beyond what is acceptable. And that's causing some serious problems. So your question, I guess that's getting to the point that what are the alternatives? Now, communities have used nitrogen-fixing plants and crops. So all our legumes, the beans, they fix nitrogen and they leave some of that in the cropping system. So to the extent that we can intercrop our cereal crops, which don't fix nitrogen, with legume crops, gives you the potential to sort of optimize a little bit more the nitrogen demand. So there is a huge, in the agroecological sense, that's a game changer to the extent we can do that. Now, this morning I cited the example whereby in Mexico, earlier this year, they discovered corn that apparently is able to fix its own nitrogen. Oaxaca, in the region where Mexico is where corn originated, originally are the precursors of the current corn crop. And communities had preserved this particular variety of maize that is associated with a microbe that, and they produce a gum on the roots of the corn crop, and the microbes get into that gum and fix nitrogen. So this is really huge. If that could be captured somehow and transformed via various processes to spread it to some of the other cereal crops, it would be huge, right? So we're getting there. We've recognized that this is an issue, and we need to fix it. I mean, so not a simple answer, but the world is trying very hard because it is a huge problem for us already.
And that's the sort of depth of answer that you get when you ask a climate-smart agriculture specialist. Thanks very much, Eric. Let me ask let's perhaps deal with some of these other questions as well, in terms of diversification of tree crops in these projects. How do we achieve that, or how replicable is the model you describe?
Yeah, if we see the Tajikistan experience, for example, the improved land management really was about soil conservation, water conservation, but also about food, because the new new practices that were piloted in several areas showed that people had more opportunity in their small plot of land to have more food, like having greenhouses or having several crops planted. And also there were nurseries for trees that were that were then sold to other households, to be able to also, in a way, increase their, their resilience to also climate impact, because on the river banks and, there was income diversification and income generating activities were among the highest rank also in terms of income, and that's what people talk more about. So it's a new deal, they would say, also as part of the beneficiary final assessment. But it brought us more food to the table as well. But yeah, it needs a lot of involvement, but also technical advice as well. Not only communities, but you need also the experts to tell them that, yes, that's a good practice because it has many benefits. It's not only about conserving the environment.
Yeah, regarding to the question about the trees in Africa, when we start the project with the communities, we do a participatory process, and we want to define what are the forest value the communities want to have in this project. And they mention first, they need to generate employment, they need to generate income, food, but also timber and non-timber products. So what we are looking for is to have all this variety of seeds, not only for generating income, but also for food for the communities. And in this case, the communities itself select those value chains that are the most demanded by the market because they're experienced. So we are not putting top-down the priorities of the value chain, but we respect the decision of the community from bottom up. And the replication of the model, I think that something that is going very well is that community have now an income that they don't have before. and it's going to be more respectful for the protected and core zones, because they are living on the multiple uses zone, and they sometimes go in the buffer zone to select or to harvest these kind of seeds. So we have another kind of food seeds, but at this time there's not demand on the market. So that's the reason we are not moving forward to produce more or to collect more seeds.
Thanks very much, Larry. And I think that is the real challenge, isn't it? The need to merge these market incentives, people making livelihood gains, with the sort of the diversification and resilience that you get from having multiple crops. It's a challenge to get the organizations that can develop multiple value chains, and you need to have quite sophisticated organization to do that. Let's open up for another set of questions. We've probably got time for one more round of three, and there's a hand right at the very back, and then one here in the middle. Send dispatch. Oh, and there's one right at the front. So we've got three. That's great.
Hello, my name is Yvonne. I have two questions. One is regarding the project in Honduras. I was hoping you could touch on some of the lessons learned, especially dealing with community-based projects with the level of ownership, because there are various factions of production. There are, even within the small scaleholder farmers, there are different scales of production. And I really want to know how you handle these kind of differences among the farming communities of the farmers. And also, the second one is on the Tajikistan project. I wanted to know some of the structures that you put in place to ensure the sustainability of this project, because usually when these funding come in, there are lots of money available and people are very incentivized. But after the project and there's no money to sustain it, these practices are not adhered to in the long term. So what are some of the structures you put in place to ensure sustainability is sustainable? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those two questions. And then we had a lady in the middle here. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Robi Hali from the Indigenous Peoples Major Group. This is for the project in Guatemala. First, I'd like to know if it's implemented with indigenous peoples there. If yes, it would be interesting to know how the traditional knowledge and natural resource management systems of indigenous peoples are integrated in the project design, because it would be good to bring out in this session how our ways of life as indigenous peoples are contributing to food security and at the same time sustaining forests.
Thank you very much for that important question. And finally, in the middle, I think we'll just restrict it to those three. If you
Hi, my name is Daniela Schweitzer. I am a postdoc at ETH and Utrecht University. My question was kind of for Karen, but she's not here anymore. But it's she talked in the plenary and then here again about challenging business as usual, and I wanted to see how that could be operationalized in more concrete examples. For example, I know that a challenge in involving the private sector in forest and landscape restoration has to do with the long term of returns, and also who is going to take on the risks that is involved in getting community-based initiatives to a market scale in which they can provide products continuously to the market and meet the demands of the private sector. So I was wondering a bit of insights on that, filling those gaps.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to turn to the panel to answer those questions. So we have questions of community ownership, of sustainability after the project, how traditional knowledge, indigenous people's traditional knowledge was integrated, and then how do you challenge this business as usual, the tyranny of pursuing returns. And after the panelists have given their answer, I'm going to hand over to Eduardo Mansur, who will give us some summary closing remarks. Thanks. Who would like to go first? Larry, okay. Do you want to take it?
Yeah.
We'll do it the other way this time.
First, I'm going to to speak about the indigenous population that we have in Guatemala is the Quechua population, Quechua culture, and we respect most of the cultural traditions. For example, when we opened this facility for drying the cocoa, they did a ceremony called the Mayejac, and this ceremony is to bless the facility to dry the cocoa in order to avoid people come and destroy the facility. We also, in every plantation, we are having these kind of ceremonies where they put all the seeds together and they pray for having a good harvest. So I think that we are very cultural, respectful for the traditions in Guatemalan culture, because on the other hand, if you don't respect, they don't allow you to go into the community. So that's something that we respect a lot. And on the other hand, the small-scale production, we have this conversation with communities in order to see how much land a farmer needs to have their living income. And they define that 1 hectare by each one of the farmers is the limit of to having the living income. So they need to have one hectare by itself, each one. So if they can have only to 5 hectares, there's not too much greed to increase the production, because there are communities that don't want to get rich, or they don't have the capitalist or the excited view of the accumulation, but they have the commonwealth, and they know that there's going to be a community that has too much cocoa. There's going to be another community that are going to be left of the production. So they have their own rules to balance the production within the community. And also, I could say that depends on the market also, but there's going to like an increasing of production every year. And they are like taking the decisions as a governance of the cooperative and the committee of second level in order to keep this balance between the production and the market demand.
Okay, so maybe on the question of sustainability, yes, that's a very good question. And I think for all of us that work on projects on several countries or programs, this is what really, especially when you come at project closer, this is on how you realistically assess that the structures that you built and supported under the project will continue. In the case of the Tajikistan project, it was a very bottom-up approach. The project itself was managed at the center government by the Committee of Environmental Protection, but everything else happened at the very local level. And at the village level, we also supported these village committees. These structures will continue to exist also. It's their traditional way of organizing, of deciding on priorities for their village, and also on funds where available. As regards pasture unions and water management organizations, the project worked on 16 water user organizations and 8 pasture unions, and I have to say that they are continuing their activity, because the project tried not only to just give the financing upfront to them, not use them as a vehicle to implement the investment, but also put a lot of effort in building their capacity. And in the meantime, also the legal basis was developing. So we had a new pasture law, we had a new water law, and so these experiences were embedded as well in the legal framework. And not only that, but we supported these organizations with management plans that are of a 10-year period, which also we used what we call management effectiveness tools. In fact, there are simple indicators. Then the board of this organization should measure their own performance in terms of fees that they are collecting and how are they reusing them, reinvesting either for water management or pasture management. But yeah, this is a big challenge, but I think the model is there, and hopefully also the government will continue to support as well, or other donors.
Great, thank you, Drita. Eric, would you like to have the closing word from the panel on these issues?
Yeah, let me try. The question, I think, about the business as usual kind of approach is a very interesting one. As I was highlighting in some of the lessons learned so far from our jurisdictional approach examples that currently exist, it's clear that, you know, given the time frame for that's required essentially to have good engagement, empowerment of all the stakeholders in the value chain, there are flexible models required to make sure that stakeholders can continue to be part of that process. Because otherwise, you know, as somebody has highlighted in some of the questions, money comes in, the project runs for 2 or 3 years, ends, and then everybody's kind of left wondering what to do. So, I mean, what some of the models are showing is that, yes, there is a production element, there is a commodity produced, that commodity goes to market, and you have opportunities in that value chain to sort of, to add premium components based on land use practices. That can happen. You see it increasingly now in cocoa. You see it with coffee, shade coffee, for example. You know, what is it? That bird-friendly coffee that exists because what's that? It's coffee that's grown under shade trees. And it turns out that many of the migrant songbirds that leave the US fly to Central America and head down south, and they spend a bit more time in these shade coffee plantations. So it generates this story in people's minds that, you know, I'd really like this little songbird that comes to my garden to have a little hotel that it can sort of hang around in and sort of be happy, and then sort of has enough strength to come back. So you're actually going to pay a bit more money for that. So that's one example. It's actually working. Bird-friendly coffee is a mark or is a brand that you can actually buy for that. So that's one angle. What are the premiums that you can have for commodities? The second one, I think, that's increasingly important is how do we, in addition to the commodity, how do we integrate into that production the services, whether the ecosystem services associated with that production? I mean, Rita and you were sort of highlighting some of the social value, the cultural value, the soil carbon sequestration, the water quality situation, you know, and that is increasingly really quite useful. Based on that earlier question about the industrial or the reliance on fossil fuels, the Costa Rican example is classic, right? The Costa Rican example of payment for ecosystem services was initiated by taking 3% of the gasoline tax, a fossil fuel, and adding it and providing $200 million plus for local stakeholders, land users to use to be paid for, to be compensated for ecosystem services. They put their money where their mouths were. I mean, we haven't had too many examples where you actually take a fossil fuel tax and apply it to a green commodity chain. So that's one, but there are many others now emerging that I think we should take a careful look at. You have both the commodity and the ecosystem service, and to the extent that ecosystem service is important for sustainability, builds on indigenous and cultural and intergenerational knowledge, then you have a premium, and the market has to sort of come up with the mechanisms for that. So this is something in the bank we're working very hard on sort of trying to sort of what are the financial incentives, what are the legal frameworks that actually harness international, national agreements to put these kinds of mechanisms to make them useful and profitable and community-based, stakeholder-based, equitable. equity is the name of the game. How do we sort of share prosperity, right? Eliminate this very desperate, extreme poverty that exists, and then lift all the boats. Otherwise, the river or the water comes up and 80% of the boats sink. That's not good. No. That metaphor is, you want everything to lift. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think that's a lovely note to finish on, this need to sort of organize, strengthen organization, both around the market, but also around these other ecosystem and social benefits. How do we get that organization in place to build equity? I'm going to hand now for closing remarks to Eduardo Mansour. Eduardo is trained as a forester. He's a Brazilian national and has been assistant director of the International Tropical Timber Organization, but now for some time has worked at FAO. Is the director of the Land and Water Division. So another person eminently suited to give some closing remarks on food and forests. Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I'll try to do it very quick. We are out of time already, and yes, I'm one of the gray hair resilient guys that started when the IUCN invented the Global Partnership on Forest Landscape Restoration, and we believe on it, and here we are. And what a session, what a progress we could see. Those gray hair here, like Eric and me, you're getting gray hair too, Duncan. He was our kid at that time, now we are all in the same range. It was a tremendous lesson. Look, we started caring, the deputy mayor of Bonn, talking about becoming drivers of positive change today. And then Karen insisted, both at the plenary and here, for urgent transition to sustainable production systems. And then Hiroto, looking at the importance, Hiroto Mitsugi, my colleague from FAO, Assistant Director General, mentioned coming out of, thinking outside the box, breaking the forest and food silo. And Duncan put it so nicely. We have to see food and forest together. And we know that the enemies of the landscapes and the forests are the agricultural land, because the major cause of deforestation is land use change, and mostly for food production. So, but we also know, and we are very happy to say it in FAO, we don't need to cut one more tree to produce the food we need. If we restore the degraded land that exists in this planet, and if we increase productivity using wisely our agro-biodiversity natural resources, we have the food. And if we stop wasting it, we have a lot of food for the generations to come. We already produce food for the 10 billion people that we may be in 2050 here. Let me come back for the summary of this, because I found it very inspiring when Eric brought to us the jurisdictional approach to mitigate deforestation. He mentioned that it can take time. Yes, but it's a serious look of doing something very concrete. You remember that we started discussing forests in the climate agenda, and everybody was interested on the permanence of the carbon, on the avoided leakage, on the additionality of this carbon. But the jurisdictional approach brings something that's very important too, which is the no double dipping, is the registry, is the system that we are going to make sure that what we are saying is happening on the ground. So very important to do. Beautiful examples from Tajikistan and Guatemala. Congratulations to Rita and Larry, because one thing that struck me, these are very well-run projects. Did you see the baseline? They can tell us gender disaggregated data on impact. How many of our projects can say so? 53% of the people have 20% income, 48% of them are women. It is a good baseline, good monitoring, showing results. And I think this was very, very important. And in Tajikistan, we can all leave this room saying that 44,000 hectares are sustainably managed. So congratulations. And in Guatemala, the value chain was very, very rich. Guys, linking, one colleague from, it was Tom Hammond, who works with us, passed to me a message that he thinks would be important, and I endorse. Linking the economic sustainable food systems with the economics of restoration and resilient ecosystems can truly build the win-win scenario. So how we'll move out of this loop of a project end, how we move into sustainability, we have to link with cash, with generation of income. And the agrobiodiversity offers beautiful opportunity. The lady from Africa who commented, 800 trees produce food products in Africa. How many we trade? We know the agrobiodiversity is gigantic. But the trade on food systems are linked to 6-7 crops, 6-7 animal species, the bulk of the trade. Because we are restricted to something that has been, I like very much the question of oil addiction and food industry. I have to bring that to FAO, it will be great. That's why it's nice to have the young people here, and they think outside the box already. How we measure production in agriculture? We measure it to tons per hectare or calories per kilo. Why don't we measure it by nutrition value, by vitamins and micronutrients and things that would increase our diversity based on agrobiodiversity and reduce the need to have more and more areas of commodity food? What do we want to eat? Do we want to eat commodities or we want to eat food? So we have this option in our hands, and I think this session was tremendously inspiring for coming to what Duncan put on the beginning, which is food and forest together. Yes, it's possible. Yes, it has been demonstrated. If it generates cash, it is sustainable. I think this is my take-home message, and thank you very much for all of you.
Very good. That's all, folks.